Welcome to the webinar on scientific paper writing. It's organized by Bhutan Health Journal, which is a scientific journal published by KGUMSB University of Medical Sciences of Bhutan. So today we'll be basically speaking on scientific paper writing, and with that, I hope Professor Willie, you got my mail in the morning, where you can, if you have time, I was requesting you to even look at the ethical issues and the reviews. So we'll talk about that later. And okay. Somebody's saying something. Dichen.
Yes, ma'am.
Dichen?
Yes, ma'am.
It seems some people can't hear. Is everyone able to hear?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Maybe some, those who can't hear, please, maybe you can log out once and log in again. Maybe something from some problem there. So we'll move ahead. So we have drawn a simple agenda to follow the so that the proceedings go smoothly. So first of all, it will be introduction of the chair by the managing editor. First of all, maybe I have to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Quinzang. I work as the managing editor for the Bhutan Health Journal. And actually, by profession, I'm a medical biochemist and work in the faculty postgraduate medicine as a teacher, assistant professor of chemistry. So if you go by the agenda, firstly of the introduction by the chair, managing editor, then welcome and opening remarks by the chair. The session will be chaired by the chief editor, Dr. Phupdoji today, and introduction of the moderator, I'll be doing it, and introduction of the speaker by the moderator. And the session will be taken over by Dr. Willie, and I'll be compiling the question answers, and we'll have question answers and vote of thanks by editor-in-chief. So certain rules that we will have today is like, maybe we can put off the cameras when not needed. And if you need to speak up, please raise your hands, and our IT will give you the permission to speak. And yesterday's session also, I think people were raising hands and he had given permission, but nobody spoke. Everybody was writing in the chat box or in the QA section. So if you have any questions or comments, please write in the QA section, because to juggle from the chat and QA, it takes time, and then sometimes maybe we must have missed some questions also. So put all the questions in the QA section only, so that it's easier. So we'll move ahead, and so I will introduce our chair today. Dr. Phupdoji is the editor-in-chief of Bhutan Health Journal. Sir has been heading this project ever since we established this Bhutan Health Journal in 2015. So Sir has been the editor-in-chief, and under his leadership and guidance, we have come a long way, and we have improved over many years now, but we still have many more things to do. And Sir is a gynecologist by profession, and he is also the head of the HM's Kidney Unit, His Majesty's People's Project in the country. So now I hand over to Sir to kindly open the session and with your welcome remarks.
Thank you, Quinzang. Very good evening to Professor Willie from Bhutan, from the faculty's behalf, from my behalf, from everybody for helping us and for being with us for the third time for the Bhutan Health Journal. It was in 2015 that we had your guidance that really helped us. So a very good morning to all the attendees in Bhutan, the different parts of the country, and the students and faculties, colleagues who are thinking to write a scientific paper. This is a golden opportunity, because Bhutan Health Journal also got a very high, like a speed booster when Professor Willie gave us the he talks in 2015 when we were starting from the scratch. So it's a golden opportunity to hear from the expert himself that took us from the very scratch to now we are running the journal for the 7th edition, that the 7th year running. And we are there are some more ways to go, miles to cover, but we are almost half the way. And it was, we could not have achieved this far without the guidance received from Professor Willie and his team. That time, Professor Phillips, Professor Kabe, a great team came and gave us a big boost. And today, within our country also, situation is changing. The civil servants are needing, for their promotions, needing scientific papers to be before the promotion. And with the academic atmosphere coming in with the university, this is a academically required area where where all the people need to publish paper. And then Bhutan Health Journal is the form that the university has created under the leadership of Honorable President, that it is a platform, it's an opportunity where we need to grow together, because this is the window of the university to the world, the Bhutan Health Journal. And it is our small effort that we are, from day one, we have been trying to groom people to do research, how to do research, giving training on research methodology, and also giving training on scientific writing, giving training on peer reviewing and editorial processing. So we want to grow together. We want to help each other. This is a effort when with the present times of COVID, that we cannot meet face to face. So after much, we were trying to have face to face training with the authorship and training. We have target 3 or 4 times. And today's one is a blessing due to kind favor given to us by Professor Willie, that we will be mainly focusing on scientific paper writing today. And we look forward to Professor Willie's, we have a lot of new people on the board, because the team that you trained before, them have graduated. I think now in this panel, we are seeing around 65 attendees. Most of them are new. So we look forward to your guidance. BSJ also would like to thank you particularly for your guidance. And we look forward, even in future days, that we have a long way to go in our indexing process. So is always needed, sir. And I welcome you virtually to Bhutan today. And then when the COVID situation settles down, the physical visit welcome is still open for you anytime. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, sir, for the warm welcome. I will now introduce the speaker, Dr. Willie McFarland. Dr. Willie McFarland is a professor of epidemiology at the University of California in San Francisco, USA. He's also the director of Center for Public Health Research, City of San Francisco's Health Department. He conducts research on HIV prevention and elimination and on health disparities among key populations. As you may expect, for the last 16 months, most of his time has been devoted to addressing the COVID-19 epidemic in San Francisco. With high vaccination rates, this health crisis appears to be under control in his city, and life is returning to normal. Dr. Willie's normal work on HIV brings him to many parts of the world, but he tells us he loves Bhutan most of all. And we can see that. He has been here several times over the last several years. His most recent work here entails technical assistance on HIV surveillance among key populations in Bhutan, such as men who have sex with men, female sex workers, and transgender persons. Dr. Willie also has taught research methods in Bhutan, In particular, he has helped to teach how to write scientific paper here in person in the past, like what our chief editor was mentioning. He has taught students of all levels how to write research paper and has over 437 journal publications. And he's with us now to reveal the secrets on how to get published. And I hope every one of us will learn a lot from him. And I really love his teaching, so that's why I invited him to share his knowledge to all of us once again. And thank you, Professor, for consenting. And now the floor is yours. Please take us ahead. Thank you.
Kuzan Zampo, thank you. Let me make sure I can get the screen share working. Okay, can everybody, can you see my slide, the first slide?
Yes, we can see.
Okay.
Yes.
I can no longer see you, so maybe if questions come up, do feel free, as other speakers have said, to go ahead and ask the question. But I know coordinating that can be difficult, so we'll have some time, hopefully, between presentations for questions. So,
Professor, can I just interrupt?
Yes.
Can you show your video, because maybe some people might not have seen you at all?
You know, I wish I could. This laptop I have now doesn't have a camera.
Oh, okay, okay.
Yeah,
Okay,
I'm
okay,
sorry.
Okay.
Just tell everybody I'm extremely handsome, and that'll be enough.
Okay. Yeah, okay.
Or I should put a picture of some famous actor up or something and claim that it's me. Okay, so this presentation is entitled How to Write a Scientific Paper, and then particularly how to get it published, some tricks and tips that editors of scientific journals are looking for. What I hope you have, what I sent and what I hope you have is actually the entire slide set for a course at my University of California. It's 250 slides. So I think you can ask Kuzami if you can have the whole slide set if you want. What I will do tonight or this morning for you is give an overview of all the pieces of a scientific paper. And after we do that, we'll take some time for questions, maybe a little bit of a break, and then time permitting, I can take on some other topics that are in this slide set. I think it sounded like the most useful might be the ethics of publishing, the ethical considerations that authors have to have, and peer review, perhaps. Okay, so let me start. You heard that I have over 400 publications, and I'm circling back to that fact, not to brag that I have so many publications, but what I wanted to say was I would not have that many publications if I didn't have a simple model, a template, or a pattern that works for most publications on clinical research, public health, epidemiology, different fields of medicine. So this template, if you read one of my papers, it's almost like you've read all of my papers. This template works. In other words, it's as close to fill in the blank or follow the pattern, and it will help you get through writer's block. So this image here is this writer's block, this metaphor that you'll be staring, you have to write a paper, you're anxious about it, it's been on your mind, you've been procrastinating and putting it off, and it's probably because you're experiencing some writer's block. Where do you start? How do you keep it moving? So what I'm going to give to you, or what I want to share with you, is a pattern, a template, a model, that if you feel this writer's block, just fall back on this model and say, okay, what was it that Professor Willie said? What did Willie say that are the pieces that I could work on, and fill in the blanks? What I'll also share with you is some of the ins and outs of submitting a paper to a journal, the tricks to get it published, to get it noticed, to have an editor give a favorable review of your paper. And what we usually do with these workshops is we work through the first version of the paper. And then over time, you have a template that you can use for future papers. Okay, and then along the way, I'll share with you some tips and tricks to keep things moving forward. Okay, let me share with you what I think are the top 10 tips to keep your manuscript moving forward, to keep in mind to get your paper published. Okay, this is my main advice, my number one tip to keep in mind. It's this: write to the message, not the topic. Now, this expression, this trick was told to me by a colleague at my university who was an editor for Lancet for 12 years. And he said basically 17,000 manuscripts came across his desk during that time. And he said, I think writers would like to think I carefully read each and every one of them, read every word of them, and made a decision based on that. But I'll be honest, that's not what I do. What I do is I just look at a few places, and what I'm doing is to see, can I quickly see a message in that paper? So write to the message. Why not the topic? Writing to the topic is like you're doing a homework assignment, that you're doing a thesis, you're doing a dissertation, where you're trying to demonstrate you know everything about this topic. That's the temptation that a lot of people fall into when they're writing a paper, especially early on. They feel it's their obligation to show that they know everything about that topic before proceeding to what their research was about. That's not the trick. The trick is the people in the field know these topics. What they want to know is something new, something that nobody else knows. And that's the nature of the research. So the message is, what do you add to the literature that's not been said before? And if you get sidetracked and distracted into thinking that you have to first write about everything that's been said on the topic, then that's a recipe for getting stuck. So look for your message early on. And I'll say this as well: try to find one message. That another trap that writers fall into is their research found a lot of exciting things, many findings, many new findings, and they want to say them all, and they want to say them all at once. That's another reason to get writer's block. It's really difficult to say everything you want to say all at once. So try to isolate what is the single most important finding that's new. Now, you can bring in those other findings a bit later, but if you focus on one main topic, one main message, the most important thing you'd want to say, then you can move forward rather than getting distracted by saying too much all at once. Okay, so find the message of your paper, find the message of your research, this study that you just did, as soon as you can. And it should be there. If you have an IRB approved protocol, the message probably is your specific aim number one, or objective number one. Objective number one is usually what you designed the study around to be able to answer that particular question. So if you're writing your first paper on this study, it should be the answer to question number one, objective number one. And again, you've probably answered a few questions in your study, but try to look at aim number one first and see if your message is there. Okay, so to repeat, your job is not to show you know everything about the topic. So this is not a dissertation. Now, if this was your PhD dissertation, then yes, you do have to demonstrate a knowledge of all the literature. But for a new study, what you're really trying to demonstrate is you adding one thing that was not known before. Okay, so rather what you have is a clear message that adds something new. And having the clear message up front so that that very busy editor can see it, no matter where they look, they see that same message. That will increase your chance that the editor will accept the paper. Okay. So again, my colleague at UCSF, who was a editor for The Lancet for many years, said, you know, it would probably break writers' hearts to know that I don't read everything they've written. In fact, I have to confess, he's saying, I have to confess that I really only read 4 sentences and to make a judgment on the paper. And so he's looking for, he says, I'm looking for this clear message in one of 4 places, or the same message in all 4 places. So what are those four places? The message should be anticipated in the title. So obviously everybody who searches PubMed, searches the literature, Google Scholar, an editor sees a new manuscript, they're definitely going to look at the title. So that's the first place that you can grab them. That the title should say something about what the message is going to be. The second place is in the abstract. Now, this editor friend of mine said he didn't always read the entire abstract even. He said, I will read the last sentence of the abstract. So the background I'm not interested in, I'll get the methods later, the results are a bunch of numbers. What did they say as the final sentence of the abstract? That's their main message. That's their conclusion. That's what I'll read. Then I flip to near the back of the paper, and he says, I will read the first sentence of the first paragraph of the discussion. And I don't know if you do this, but I'm sure I do, and I've seen others do it. If you have a stack of papers that you're trying to get through quickly, you do flip to that discussion section, first paragraph, first sentence, and you're hoping that that will tell you what that whole study was about, so you don't necessarily have to read the whole thing. So the editor says, that's where I'll look for the message to. And then the last place to put it is what was the cover letter to the editor. I mean, back before online submissions, you would literally write out in print a physical letter to the editor. And in that letter, you would quickly say why this paper is important and this journal should publish it. In the online submission era, there is a little box that says, it'll say optional. Definitely put something there. So it'll say optional. Is there something you would like to tell the editor? Is there something that won't be part of the paper, but you would like to say? This is your opportunity to quickly put that message of your paper right there. So with those 4 places, my editor friend colleague said he could pretty much make a decision on whether he would move the paper forward out to peer review, or he would give it a quick rejection, that it had to have some sort of message that was interesting. The extra tip I'll say is keep those 4 things very short. You know, don't make this busy editor read a lot of words to get to the message. In fact, my advice is, see if you can get your sentences to under 22 words. Now, I think you're familiar with the style of scientific writing, that it's very long, complicated sentences with big words. That's actually not good scientific writing. Scientific writing should be incapable of misunderstanding. It should be simple, direct, short sentences, 1 idea per sentence. Okay, so the extra tip is find your message and try to say it in 22 words or less. Okay, so he literally said that to me. He said, keep your sentences around 22 words. Keep these messages around 22 words. And I remembered when he said it, I said, you know, my high school English teacher said the same thing. She would give us marks off if we had sentences that were too long. They ran on, they had too many ideas and jam-packed into one sentence. She would say, break it up into sentences of about 22 words each. So it is something of a rule of clear writing to keep sentences short. So I said, okay. He said this. I said, the very next paper I write, I will do exactly what he said. I will craft the same message of the paper in 4 times in 4 different places, and I'll keep it to 22 words, and I'll see what happens. So, okay, now so here's an example of what I'm talking about. This was a prevention trial that used peer educators at drinking venues in Zimbabwe, and we wanted to see if it would reduce HIV risk among male beer drinkers. Okay, so turns out the intervention did not do that. It did not successfully reduce sexual risk behavior among beer drinkers, and the fact that it didn't work makes it a hard paper to publish. You know, you want it to work. It's hard to write up an experiment that doesn't work, but it's still scientific. You need to publish things that have negative findings as well as positive. Okay, so how does this work? Here's the message anticipated in the title. Evaluation of a peer-based sexual risk reduction intervention for men in beer halls in Zimbabwe, results from a randomized controlled trial. So the answer isn't quite there, but that title implies that that this paper will answer that. The question on everybody's mind reading the title should be, oh, I wonder if it worked. Did it work? So that anticipates the message. And then the message itself has to be a very clear statement of whether it worked or not. So the last sentence of the abstract. So this is where my editor friend said, put your message as the last sentence of the abstract. Okay, here's the message. Our study found no evidence that peers affected their beer drinking friends' behavior. Other ways to engage men in HIV prevention are needed. Okay, again, I deliberately made it exactly 22 words, trying to make it clear my message is this approach to HIV prevention did not work. Okay, then the third place was that first paragraph, first sentence of the discussion. And here I said, again, it's the same message said a little bit differently. While not what we hoped, we found no evidence that our peer intervention reduced HIV risk-related behavior among male beer hall patrons. Again, 22 words, clear statement of this type of intervention did not work. Then there's the fourth place, the cover letter to the editor. So it's actually wise to look online and find out the actual name of the editor and address this cover letter this way. So this, again, used to be an actual physical letter that you would, when you Xeroxed your manuscript and mailed it to the journal, you'd put a cover letter on. But now it's in the online submission, it's a little box that says optional to the editor. So definitely use that option. And you say something like this again, the message. Dear Professor Kalichman, we have strong RCT evidence that a peer education intervention did not reduce men's risk for HIV associated with alcohol in an African setting. Again, 22 words. So did it work? I mean, it was accepted by this journal on the first submission. And I'd like to think that it helps. And I have followed this pattern through 400 more publications. So again, this is tip number 1 of how to get the journal's attention that your research adds something new to the literature, and that's why the journal wants to publish it. They don't want to publish a paper that simply repeats and synthesizes what the literature has said, and unless they're asking for a review paper, that's something different, of course. But if you have a new study that acquired new data, new knowledge for the world, its value is in what it adds that's new. And that's what a journal is looking for. Okay. When we do this workshop, I really wish I could be there in person in Bhutan. As was said, I love Bhutan. It's the most beautiful country in the world, most friendly place in the world. The other reason I'd like to be there is because this works better face-to-face, where if we do it as a workshop over the course of a week, retreat into somewhere nice, we can actually get you to say the message of your paper. We can actually work one-on-one and help edit the different sections of the papers. It works much better to do it that way. So one thing we do in the workshop, we do with our students, we do with our residents, our postdoctoral fellows, is what we call the elevator test. And I don't know if you've heard of this before or get where I'm going with it. The idea is this. I don't know if it's actually happened to you, but you get in the elevator with your boss or some colleague that you know, and she asks, "Oh, hi." You know, the elevator conversations are always short and awkward, and you don't have much time to say very much. But nonetheless, the question is often like, "Oh, yes, you did that study in China. What did you find?" Now, the situation does not lend itself to going in depth into the methodology. It does not lend itself to talking about the limitations and the challenges of the study. What really is going on here is they're looking for what's the message of that study. And so in a real sort of everyday interaction, rehearsing the quickest way to tell someone what the message of that study was, that's what you center your paper on. That's what the message of your paper is. How would you say that in an elevator? Okay, and so you have just 1 minute. You really can only say 1 or 2 sentences at the most. So tell her the message of your study in less than a minute before her floor, and extra credit or bonus if you can keep it down to 22 words. Okay, so that would go something like this. Yes, peers doing HIV testing and case management, increased diagnosis and linkage to care for drug users in China. So that's 18 words. And that's the idea of the message. That's the idea of communicating very quickly what your study adds to the literature, what is new about it, what's interesting about it. And if you were to just say that, if that's all the editor understood, if that's all the reader of your paper remembers, then you're actually successful. That's what gets a paper accepted, and that's what gets a paper cited by other researchers. It's very clear what the message is. Another example, a large proportion of adolescents in Jamaica report early sexual initiation and behaviors that place them at risk for STI and HIV. So now, again, 22 words. This was our survey of Jamaican teens. What did you find? Quick, easy message. This is what's new. Okay. So that was tip number 1. Again, I started with the most important, and if you remember this idea that if you're writing up your paper, you're writing up your findings, begin with saying, what is the message? What is the question that I've answered? What is new? And how would I say that to the editor of a journal or someone in an elevator so they would not miss the main point and don't get distracted in different directions? Okay, tip number 2, or metaphor number 2. Know where you're going and work backwards. So the metaphor is it's easier to go down a mountain than up a mountain. And what do I mean by this? Well, it echoes the first tip, of course. It echoes the idea that start by finding your main conclusion, your main message, and then write the paper of how you got that message. But it also means the order of how you would write your paper that I want to recommend to you. Now, if you've read papers or looked at various journals, I'm sure you're all very familiar with how they're organized and laid out. Standard order is abstract, introduction, methods, results, discussion, references, and tables and figures usually embedded throughout. That's the order that you'll submit the manuscript. It'll be composed in this way, but I would recommend don't do it in this order. Do it in a different order. To me, this is the difficulty of climbing up the mountain rather than walking down the mountain. For example, starting with the introduction, you feel that, well, I have to synthesize the body of literature. That can take a long time and get you stuck. Oh, well, I got to explain the methods next. We have a protocol. I'll see if I can shorten that in some way. again, you're going to end up saying far more detail than is expected in a journal publication if you're drawing from your protocol or your standard operating procedures. So let me propose, I think this is one thing that we've come to call the WOW, the Willie's order of writing, or Willie's way of writing. This is the order that I recommend you write your paper. Start with 3 tables and 1 figure. Get your 3 tables and 1 figure very clear first. Then don't go to the abstract, don't go to the introduction. Look at those tables and write the results. Okay, so the tables are your data in numbers and figures. The results walks the reader through those tables in words. Okay, then again, don't go to the top of this manuscript, go next to the discussion. Because so the numbers and figures show the data. The results put the main findings in words, but just the facts. The discussion tells what is important about these facts. So that's the progression. And then go to the introduction after you've done that. The introduction merely sets up the question that you're going to answer. So it's easier to answer the question first and then go to the introduction and say, look, I'm going to pose a question here, as if you didn't already know the answer. The methods, I would say, fill in later, because what you want to do is just tell people how you got to that answer. No more, no less. If you do that too soon, you'll have a tendency to put too much and unnecessary material. And at the same time, you may also leave something important out. The abstract, I know that the temptation is to start there because it's short, it feels easy to write, or you had a conference presentation and you already had an abstract. Things change along the way though. If you leave it to the end, you can just draw from things that you've already written. And then references is a check that you have to do probably along the way, but you should always double check them at the end. This order, to me, is running down the mountain. Again, you start with the data, start with the numbers, talk about the facts, tell the meaning of the facts, get to the point of the question, and you'll be running downhill. Okay, maybe I'll elaborate a little bit more. The 3 tables and 1 figure. Now I say 3 tables and 1 figure. Many journals will actually have that limit. Many journals will actually say you're only allowed 4 tables. If you have a figure, you may have 3 tables and 1 figure. So many health journals are now saying try to limit yourself to 3 tables and 1 figure. Not all of them. If you feel you need more of them, there might be some exceptions, but I would say that most studies presenting new data can be done with 3 tables and 1 figure. So these 3 tables and 1 figure tells the whole story in numbers. Do this first for a lot of reasons. One is it clarifies what you need to say. It crystallizes the message you're looking at. And it also is a check to make sure the analysis is complete. If you start writing before the analysis is complete, you hit a lot of dead ends. You have to go back. You may stop. You have to do more analyses. It's better to make sure that you've completed the analysis before writing. The other thing I'd like to see in the tables and figures is it passes what I call the fall on the ground test. So what do I mean by the fall on the ground test? What I mean by that is if I were walking across my campus and I saw some litter on the ground, so I go to pick it up and it's 4 pieces of paper. And I look at those 4 pieces of paper and it says, one says table 1, description of study participants in a randomized trial of beer hall patrons in Zimbabwe. I say, oh, I know exactly what that is. Second piece, intervention and control risk behaviors at study end among beer hall patrons. And I say, oh, I know exactly what this is. And third table is multivariate analysis. And I would say to myself, with these 4 pieces of paper, I know what this study is about. I know who, what, where, how many, who they measured, what they measured, the outcome, and I could steal that paper. I could make up the rest and show these data, put it in a manuscript, submit it, because it's all there. The 3 tables in 1 figure are there. So they should be self-standing. And by everything there, I literally mean that the title of each table should say what's in the table, who these data were collected from, where was the study done, what year was the study done, how many participants were in the study. And that should be at the top of table 1, 2, 3 in the figure as well. Another reason to do it this way is sometimes readers looking through many journal publications will flip to the tables, and that might be all they look at. So if that's all they're looking at, make it easy for them. Each table says exactly what they're looking at. They don't have to dig into the paper. Okay, so again, if I found these 4 pieces of paper on the ground, I could steal that paper. I could make up the rest. I could fill in the blanks. Of course, I don't mean I would steal your paper, but when we do these workshops, we like to have a full draft of the manuscript at the end of the workshop, that all pieces are written. We've had a chance to help you edit them. They peer review with each other. But I consider it still a success if the 3 tables in 1 figure are complete, because that means I can help the participant of the workshop finish this paper by email. But if we don't achieve that stage, it's very hard to see the paper through. So tip number 2 is put a lot of time up front. Start with 3 tables and figures, get them perfect, and then hopefully the rest of the paper writes itself. Okay. So if you just can't submit 3 tables and a figure to a journal. You do have to write something. And what the results section is it's not putting every single number in every single table into sentences, but you are saying in words the important parts of those tables and figures. So you don't have to put them all in words, but you pick out the most important parts. So what you're saying is, dear reader, if you look at my tables and figures, you'll see the whole story. But let me walk you through what the most important points to make about this story is. And then you walk the reader through those. Now, to make it easy on them, follow the same order as the tables and the figures for those numbers. In other words, if you're talking about, you start talking about table 1, and you start talking about the upper left side of table 1. In other words, so if you think of someone's eyes looking at the tables and looking at what you've written, their eyes would comfortably track between, the average age was 34.6 years for women and 42.7 years for men. Those should be the first 2 numbers in that table number 1. And then you may skip a few numbers, but the eye still tracks exactly the same order. Now, if you feel you should write about something more important earlier on, go ahead and change the order in the table, or vice versa. If you're saying if you're writing in writing and you think, oh, I'd rather say this first, then change the table to reflect that. Okay. So again, you're saying, dear reader, let me walk you through the key points. It's all there in the tables. I'll walk you through where they are, but let me point out the best things. Okay, now you go to the discussion. The discussion tells the meaning of these facts. In other words, just saying something like the average age of the women was 36.7, the average age of men was 42.8. You're not saying why that's important. You're not saying why men are older than women. You're not saying, does this compare to studies in China? You're just stating the facts. The discussion is where you say why you told them this. Why was it that this population men were older than the women? Why this population maybe younger than other countries where they did similar studies. So that's if you're talking about other studies, talking about why you're telling people this, that's the discussion section. So, but what you really have to do in the discussion section is answer a question. And in that first paragraph of the first sentence of the first paragraph of the discussion is, once again, it's that message, it's the answer to a question. And that answer is the question that is posed in the introduction. So that's why I'm saying do the discussion section before you do the introduction. Because once you zero in on what the answer is, the introduction is really just posing that question. Again, you're pretending, when you're writing the introduction, you're pretending that you haven't already answered it. But if you start with the introduction, you can pose all kinds of questions that you're never going to answer. In fact, in the universe, there are infinite number of unanswered questions. So you can't talk about all those things. You don't need to talk about all those things. In fact, if you talk about questions that you're not going to answer, your reader will be very disappointed. They started reading your introduction and you posed a very important question, but that was not the one you actually answered. They'll be frustrated and editor will be frustrated. So if you write the discussion section, you're answering the question that your study asked, then go back to the introduction. So introduction is really asking a question. You only need to introduce things that are relevant to the discussion. So all those papers on other aspects of the topic don't need to be in the introduction if they have nothing to do with what you actually did answer. So it gives you a filter to focus very, very quickly. If you start with the introduction, you will always have other things to read. There's always another paper that you'll find in a literature search. There's always a paper your professor will hand to you to read. And then you'll constantly be updating your introduction. You'll be adding more things and more things. And you get the feeling that it might never end. So do it last, and then you'll know exactly where you need to focus it. There is another reason why I caution students and residents and fellows not to start with the introduction. And that's because if we have time, we'll talk about plagiarism later. Starting with the introduction runs the risk of plagiarism. Why do I say this? Well, picture yourself, you read a paper and then you say, oh, this is a very important paper on my topic. Let me cut and paste the main point of this paper into my introduction, and let me cut and paste another one. And then you lose track about what you actually cut and paste from other journals. And then you forget those weren't your words. So plagiarism is where you put into a paper other people's words from other papers. If you are in this habit of summarizing a lot of studies, it's very tempting to just write a lot of the words that they've written or cut and paste the words that they've written. Don't do that. And I think if you do the introduction last, it'll end up being much more in your own words at that point and not a summary of other people's words. Okay, so here's this image that I was, the diagram or image of what I was explaining here. The progression of the introduction, if you've ever read, typical paper, public health paper, for example, it starts with the big picture. It might be almost cliche sounding, something like HIV, 33 million people in the world are living with HIV. So it starts with this big picture, how important this disease is on a global perspective. That usually is what the first paragraph is. Then the second paragraph gets quickly to the specific issue and what's known about a specific issue. If, for example, yes, HIV, 33 million people worldwide, the next paragraph, but you get to the specific. Well, what is the specific? Would be, well, transgender women are among the most severely affected by HIV. Okay, you go from the big picture to a more specific issue. But what you're really trying to do is find the gap in the knowledge. Again, you're not trying to summarize every single thing that's known about HIV or known about HIV and trans women. You're looking for a gap. Maybe that gap, in the case that comes to mind, would be to date, no study has measured HIV prevalence among transgender women in Bhutan. Could be one gap. So, and that gap, or we're saying we don't know the prevalence of HIV in Bhutan. You're posing a question. So this is the question that your discussion section will answer. So that's the question. We don't know the HIV prevalence among transgender women in Bhutan. Ask the question, and then the answer is that first sentence of the discussion. We found the prevalence of HIV to be 33% among transgender women in Bhutan. I made that figure up, by the way, so don't use that one. But that's the idea, that if you know where you're going is we've measured for the very first time the prevalence of this disease. Then the introduction, just flip it around and say, we don't know the prevalence of this disease in Bhutan. So you flip it around so you answer a very specific question that's posed in the introduction. And then from there, the discussion builds the other way. Okay, that's the gap in knowledge that we filled with new data. And the specific issue, let's go a little bit further and compare to other studies in the region, worldwide. What are they finding? Do we disagree with them? Do we corroborate what they find? And then the paper tends to end again on the big picture. And the big picture can be, well, where do we go from here? This opens the door to the need for HIV testing programs that are transgender friendly, that we need outreach, we need trans peer educators to do HIV testing. What's the future hold? Where do we go from here? What does the data suggest that we might do about this? So this is the mirror image of how the introduction is structured and is a mirror reflection of the discussion section. Okay, next, methods. The methods is not a recipe for how to do this study. I was told when I was a graduate student that the method, if you know, a reader, someone who reads your methods section could reproduce your experiment or could redo your study. Not necessarily. That over time, that's not really what's happening with the methods section. If they were also expert in my field, probably they could do it. But if they've never done these methodologies before, it's not a protocol. It's not a standard operating procedure. That is far too detailed for what the methods section could be. What the methods section is really someone who is expert in your field would understand what you did and how you, and they would be convinced of the message of your findings and how they got it. And you need no more, no less than that. If there are procedures that you did or assays that you ran, lab values that are from the medical records, if they have nothing to do with your message or what you're showing, then they don't need to be there. But they certainly may have been in the protocol, for example. Those are unnecessary. In contrast, you may have done some additional experiments or some sub-analyses that are required for your message, and that wasn't in the protocol. So you might miss those as well. So that's, again, why you should do it last. Again, it's not a complete recipe. It's not a protocol. It's not a standard operating procedure. It's usually not a very long part of the, well, it's not nearly as long as a protocol would be for a manuscript or publication. Am I talking too fast? I'm worried you can understand my accent. It seems good. Are there questions that have come up already? Just checking in to make sure. Should I slow down?
I think it's okay.
Okay.
Speed.
Okay, good. Yeah, so writing the methods section too early risks missing things that you need to say and also including too much detail that you don't need to say. Okay, the abstract. We're now towards the end of the parts of the manuscript. If you leave the abstract to last, you can repeat sentences that you already said. It's not plagiarism if you are repeating something you've written in the same paper. Now you're kind of not allowed to say things that you've said in a different paper that's already published. But in the same paper you're in, you're allowed to say the same words that you already have said. So the abstract, a trick or a tip for writing a good abstract is if you gather up, if you cut and paste the first sentence of every paragraph and put them into, on one page, that pretty much would become an abstract. Now you have to streamline it. You'll probably delete a few of those sentences, but that's a trick to make the abstract be perfectly aligned with what's in the paper. And you're allowed to use sentences that you've already written for that abstract. So that's usually very easy. My experience has been most writers want to write the abstract early because it feels less daunting to write 250 words than it does to write 2,000 words, or they already have tried it. So, but if you do that, go back and look to make sure that the abstract does follow what's said in the paper. Things change along the way, especially the numbers and figures. Okay. References, here again, don't go overboard. The style in recent years is to have fewer references than many years ago. When I first started writing papers 20, 25 years ago, I asked my professor, how many references do I need? The answer is always, well, it depends. You need to cite the things you need to cite. And I'm like, yeah, but should I cite 7 things on this topic or 1 thing on this topic? The answer at that time was 45, 50 would be about right. Nowadays, it's more like 20. I think part of the issue is as the internet makes things more and more accessible, there's more and more publications. It gets harder and harder to pick the 40 or 50 that need to be there, whereas it's better to keep it streamlined and pick about 20. Now I say 20, journal instructions often tell you not to have more than 20, unless there's special circumstances like a review paper will need more than 20. So don't feel you need 10 references for a simple fact when 1 reference is fine, for example. Don't feel embarrassed if you only have 13 references in your paper. That's fine. If you're citing what you need to cite, that's okay. Okay. So that was tip number 2. It'll go faster from this point because I'm trying to give you the most important ones. So tip number 1 is identify your message and write to the message. Tip number 2 was the order of which you should write the manuscript, starting with the tables and figures and working your way through results, discussion, later introduction, methods, references, abstract. Okay. Tip number 3, follow directions. Now this is easy to say. I always remember my high school teacher saying you must follow directions. You really have to be serious about this. Follow directions. And what directions am I talking about? The journal's directions. They want submissions to look exactly like all their submissions look. So this is not the time to try to stand out with artistic flourishes. Don't be weird. Don't do things like changing font sizes, changing font types, adding color. Say more on that. Don't use footnotes, put them at the end. No extras. Again, partly I think it's a writer's trying to procrastinate a bit, and they'll say, okay, I'm gonna make these headers 1 font, and then I'm gonna have big first letters of every paragraph. I'm gonna add lots of color. Do not do that. What you get is the managers of the journal who receive the submissions do a quick spot check to see if they follow directions. If it looks weird, if you've missed something, if it didn't follow directions, they will unsubscribe that submission and send it back to you and say, follow the directions. And then one can only wonder that if, well, this person that can't seem to follow the directions, I don't know if we really want to send this to peer review because there's more processing that has to go on. So don't do anything strange, just normal font, stick to one font, no color, no extras. If you don't have a journal in mind to start with, you can follow the Vancouver guidelines. I think if you can email me, I can give you a copy of the Vancouver guidelines, but that's where it will say all the formatting that you're supposed to do, right down to the formatting of the references, what goes into each of the sections, things like that. The other thing to bear in mind is some types of papers have required formats. If it's a randomized controlled trial, there's an international consort format that you have to follow. If it's a review paper, systematic review, then you have to follow the PRISMA guidelines. Some journals for observational studies have the Strobe guidelines. But usually what you really need to do is look carefully at what journal you're submitting to gives us their instructions. Now, I think online, Bhutan Health Journal gives a lot of instruction of exactly what they want, the heading, the sections, how to do each of them. So if it's Bhutan Health Journal, look at their instructions. If it's another journal, find the website of that journal. Go somewhere on that website, if you Google New England Journal of Medicine, instructions to authors, submissions, something like this. There'll be some menu item here, for example, this is Googling Journal of Substance Use, wanted to submit to this, look for a button that says something like instructions for authors. And usually they'll have an online set of instructions that are very detailed, or you can download a PDF to follow it. Follow it word for word, letter for letter, do exactly what they say. If they say it needs to be Arial 11 font throughout, that's exactly what you do. If they say double space throughout, exactly that. Okay, so if you fail to follow the instructions, at best, they'll bounce it back to you and ask you to follow the instructions. At worst, they'll simply reject it. So follow the instructions. Okay, that was tip number 3, follow directions. Tip number 4 is 4. So this is where this is part of the way of Willie's order of writing. What I wanted to create is sort of a job aid or a one-pager that would give you the template of what each of the 4 main parts of the paper would be, and then within each of those 4 parts, 4 paragraphs that you could fill in. So in other words, if you have writer's block and you're trying to move the paper forward, simplify it this way. There's 4 by 4, 16. There's only 16 sentences that you have to think of that might put your whole paper together. And I think you've gathered some of the ones that I've said. So the 4 by 4 is this. The introduction, think of it in 4 pieces. Paragraph 1 is, what's the big picture? And that can often just be, what's the burden of the disease that you're talking about or the social condition that you're talking about? It can be globally, it can be in all of Bhutan, it can be a regional picture, but you sort of start with, why is this disease still important for health and research? Second paragraph, quickly think, what is the specific aspect of this disease that you're talking about? So if you said, malaria has yet to be eradicated from the world, great. Here's how many children die, how many pregnant women get it, Bhutan, Asia, worldwide. You're not going to talk about everything. You're going to talk about bed nets. You can say bed nets are one of the control measures for malaria, specific issue. Here's what's been tried. Here's what's known. Okay, where am I going now? Well, what is not known about this? What's the gap? And the gap should be, well, what did my study try to find out? We tried to find out whether giving free bed nets made people use them, or whether they had to pay for them made them care for something, some gap that was what your study was about. And then the 4th, so you say, this is what's not well known, some things have been tried, but it's an unanswered question. Okay, then what's the segue to the next part is, okay, to answer this question, we conducted a longitudinal household observational study of bed net usage in Bhutan, something like that. So that's the 4 pieces. And this, again, is the pattern that my 437 publications will follow. If you read any of them, you'll recognize that, yes, there's really just these 4 pieces. 1 sentence each will give you the topic sentence. It keeps it moving forward if you get stuck. Method section. There can be many subheadings in the method section, but I think there's still, for me, there's 4 pieces that I'm looking for. One is, what is the overall study design? Was this a clinical trial? Was this a survey, cross-sectional survey? Was this a case control study? Was this a retrospective review of medical records, case series, case study? What kind of study was it? I'd like to see that up front. The second piece, usually the heading is something like study participants or participants, but this is where you're saying, who did we do this study with? Then there's another part that's something about measurements, maybe instruments, maybe procedures. Okay, what were the tools to gather the data and information? And then the 4th piece is the statistical analysis. Now, I like statistics myself, but these paragraphs are so incredibly boring. And they're really boring to read, really boring to write. It has this weird language to them. Hopefully, maybe someone helping you with your statistics could write that for you, or you can see how it was done in the journal. But it is a required piece of it. Okay, so there's 4 pieces of the method section. Results section, I even give them names to remember them. 4 pieces. So you're writing your results. How do I want to organize this? Where do I start? How do I get through the results? Well, first off, the 4 pieces probably mirror the 3 tables in 1 figure. So that's 4 pieces. And that 4 pieces being the 3 tables in 1 figure, results would have 4 pieces that mirror the 3 tables in 1 figure. But there's also a very established pattern, the way these results section go. You've probably seen it. What is table number 1 usually? Table number 1 is usually the demographics, the age, gender, marital status, education level, income, residence status, things like that. So that's usually what the first paragraph will say. And I call this paragraph the trust us paragraph. Why do I call it the trust us paragraph? What you're saying here is, dear reader, I'm writing from Bhutan and you're reading my paper somewhere else. You probably want to know what my study population really looks like. Are they poor? Are they mostly women we're looking at? Are they younger age? Are they higher levels of education? I need to know what your study group looks like so I can understand why you did the intervention, why it worked or didn't work in this population, or why you saw such high prevalence or low prevalence of disease in this population. Were they very old? Were they very young? I need to know that. So that paragraph, so you don't rush right into your main finding. You got to say, okay, reader, let me describe my clinic population to you. Let me describe my population to you. Here's what they look like. They may be different than yours, but here's how they differ from yours. Okay. The second paragraph I call cool measures, because you clearly did not do a study just to describe how old people are and what their level of education is and what their income is, for example. The cool measures is you measured something new. You measured something different for the first time. Maybe it was the prevalence of dental caries in Bhutanese children. Those are what I call the cool measures. Again, don't rush to like, oh, well, the predictors of malaria bed net use were X, Y, and Z. Take a moment to say, well, wait a minute. I need to tell you how many households had a bed net. I need to tell you how many had history of malaria in the last season. Those actually are the things that your paper may get cited more for than the risk factors or the final analysis. In other words, I think one paper in the first issue of Bhutan Health Journal was about physical and sexual abuse among Bhutanese women. Again, this is new. Nobody had any idea how common these things were. So yes, there was a multivariate analysis of predictors of being sexually abused, physical abuse, but mostly people in the literature are saying, we need to know how common this phenomenon is around the world. So the interest is just what was the prevalence of those factors. So those are the cool measures. They're still descriptive, but nobody has measured them before, or they're very rare or recently measured. That actually might be what your paper is going to be cited for more than the final analysis. Okay, so that's cool measures. Then the third piece is what I call no tricks. Now, by no tricks, what I mean is the main effect of answering the question is very clear. So in other words, if your main association was low income women were more likely to be physically abused, then you see very clearly, oh yes, the majority, 55% of such women at low education level were abused, but only 23% of higher education were abused. So again, I'm making these figures up, but the idea is you don't need to be a statistician to know that 55% is higher than 23%. So there's no trick there. There's no odds ratio, multivariate analysis, adjusting for clustering effects, all those complicated statistics. It's very clear what the effect is. And maybe that's your figure, your one figure showing this, the change over time, the uptake of the control group versus in the intervention group. Show these data so any reader without a statistical background can see it, no tricks. The final piece of the results is what I call it's solid. And this is, well, you do still have to do the right statistical analysis. You will always have a peer reviewer that says, oh, but that could be confounded by age. That could be confounded by rural versus urban resident status. Did you do the multivariate analysis? So this paragraph is, this no tricks finding that you saw is solid. It holds up to the multivariate analysis. Or the solid could be a stratified analysis, or it could be another aspect of answering the question. But the idea is you're strengthening the conclusion, either statistically or with other evidence from the paper. Okay, so four pieces. Trust us, here's what my population looks like. Cool measures, these are the diseases and risk factors that have never been measured, never been published before. No tricks, here's the association that's answering our question of who is more likely to have this disease. It's solid, yes, it holds up to statistical analysis, it holds up to other data. Okay, 4 pieces. Discussion, 4 pieces, and I have names for these as well. Mission accomplished. Not only that, mea culpa, kumbaya. Now, for those of you who've heard this before, you know what I'm talking about, but these are a little bit odd, so I'll have to explain them. Mission accomplished. So if you remember tip number 1, the first paragraph and the first sentence of the first paragraph is what? It's your message. That's the mission accomplished. That is the objective number 1 of the study. It was the question posed in the introduction. It was the gap in the literature that needed to be filled. That's mission accomplished. So in this case is the prevalence of HIV among transgender women in Bhutan was 33%. You know, this is the highest of any population measured in the region. It's comparable to Paris and San Francisco. That's your mission accomplished. For the first time ever, we've measured the prevalence of HIV in this population. Okay. That is most of your, that should be most of your discussion. Again, my editor friend from the Lancet was saying, that's all he may read. If the mission accomplished, the message is not there, he's lost interest. So where do you go from here? Okay, we got the mission accomplished out of the way. You could say, okay, take a breath, We have other things we'd like to talk about. Dear reader, if you're still awake, if you're still listening, if you're still paying attention, we also found. Not only that, here's what else we found. Transgender women experience discrimination at testing sites. Transgender women have never been screened for sexually transmitted disease in our study. You could just go ahead and say all these other facts that are interesting that you were distracting in the beginning when you said, oh, Professor Willie said, pick one finding only, so I'm gonna throw all those other interesting things away. Now's the time to say, well, not only that, we found some other very interesting things. So that's that part of this discussion. Mea culpa. I don't know if you've heard this word, this expression before. It's Latin for my bad, my blame, my guilt. I'm bad. What is this section that we're talking about here? If you've read the discussion section of any scientific paper, you'll see a paragraph. You'll always see such a paragraph. It says something like, it begins with, we recognize limitations of our study, or our study is not without limitations. You've seen this, haven't you? This is the mea culpa paragraph. This is the limitations paragraph. What this paragraph does is confesses what your limitations are. So rest assured, no study is perfectly executed, perfectly designed, without bias, without challenges. All research has potential biases. All research has experienced challenges. What you're doing is you're disarming your critics by being the one to say what these problems are. If you don't say them, they'll find them or they'll presume them. And then they'll be like, aha, I got them. This study was flawed because they didn't know this limitation. But if you say the most severe limitation of our study was participation bias, we only succeeded in enrolling 33% of the eligible population, then you've taken their weapon away from them. There's nothing they can do about that. So tactically, this is what this paragraph does, but it is also scientifically correct to do this. It is up to the researcher, up to the investigator to be the person that knows the most about the limitations and biases of their study. So it's again, no study is perfect, no study is without bias. A good researcher understands what the biases are. It's also the opportunity to say, okay, here are the biases, the potential biases, but here's some other evidence why we don't think this bias overturns our conclusions. So if you confess the bias, confess the limitation, you also have the opportunity to strengthen your argument. So that's the purpose of the mea culpa. You'll notice that it's not first, never lead a discussion with saying everything wrong with your study. Remember this editor, if all they read was the sentence that said, our study was subject to multiple limitations and potential biases, game over. And if that's all they read, then you've got nothing. You also don't end on that note. It's bad, psychologically, it's bad to leave the reader with what the limitations of the study was. You want to end it on a positive note, that you want to say, yes, we know that this study has potential biases. Here's what we did to correct them. Here's what we think is still the conclusions. But you don't end on you want to end on the positive. And usually you'll see it in most of my papers, you go from the paragraph that begins, our study is subject to several limitations, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then the next paragraph says, despite limitations, our data points the direction for changing clinical practice. Our data makes a foundation for interventions to prevent HIV in this population. So you end on a positive note. And that's the fourth piece that I call the kumbaya. Kumbaya is it's a word that we use, it's a song actually. It's a word we use to say, oh, let's all feel good about this. Now, after an intense negotiation, you go out for drinks, something like this, you feel good about things. That's a kumbaya. In this journal presentation, in publishing a journal paper, the kumbaya is often, what have we learned? What are the lessons learned to move the needle forward? How do we improve clinical practice in Bhutan? How do we address the problems that we found? Okay, tip number 5. I think it's going to go quicker from this point. We're halfway through, but it'll go quicker. Okay, tip number 5, only write on a topic that interests you. Now, this should seem self-evident, right? You've picked a research topic that you're interested in, you're writing about it, but that's strangely not always the case. I know that residents are often told by their mentor, by their professors, it would be a good paper you should write about, it's this one. And then they come to the workshop, they have to write about this paper, and they can't focus on it. And then if you chat with them a little bit about what their interests are, they'll say, oh, what really interests me? And we did a previous study and we found this, but I never wrote it up. And my professor says I should write this paper instead. I say, aha, you should write the paper that interests you. If you're writing on a topic that is not interesting to you, it won't get done. It won't be written. So try to find one that truly interests you. Tip number 6, retreat. Set time aside to write. Writing takes a backseat to everything else you're doing, especially if you're seeing patients especially if you're a resident, especially if you're seeing patients. Writing a manuscript is a block of time that always gets pushed to the bottom of your to-do list. So either you have to try to discipline yourself to find free periods to write, or take a retreat, some sort of writing workshop like we used to do in Bhutan, and maybe we'll do again someday soon. Set that week aside to get a leg up on the paper. The other way that it helps is to form a little writing group. Like a lot of our postdoctoral fellows and our residents and our students will get together, and the discipline of the peer pressure, to not be the one of the group of 4 that's behind, motivates getting a paper written. So forming your own little writing groups to move the paper forward is a good idea as well. Okay, yes, mounds of things to do, it's always last. Tip number 7, peer review. There is the journal peer review when you submit the manuscript to often blinded peers or unblinded peers, but that's not what I'm talking about here. What I mean here is get one of your colleagues, one of your true peers, to read your paper and give critique to it. That's difficult to do, isn't it, though? I mean, getting criticism is in human nature, it's always hard to receive criticism, even if it's constructive and friendly. Getting it from people that you work with can actually be even harder than anonymous colleagues in the other side of the world. But it is a discipline. It is a way to improve your paper and anticipate before submission what the problems with the paper might be. Even if it's someone not in your field, in fact, there's an advantage if they're not in your field. If they can't understand your message, if they can't understand what you're saying, then the peer reviewers of the journal are probably going to have the same problem. So get a friendly, if you can, true peer to review your manuscript before you submit it. In the workshop, we build that in. The last day of the workshop, we might give a weekend or a day for them to read the paper. We practice giving and receiving peer review critique as part of writing the paper before submission. Okay. Tip number 8, write concisely. This is what my high school English teacher, my senior year of high school English teacher, would always say. To write well is to rewrite and rewrite shorter. And she really drilled this message into us. So the example I always give is, she would say, okay, I want you all to write an essay on, some American literature that we had recently read. Write an essay on this. And so you would write 10-page essay, 20-page essay on the topic, and then you'd hand it in and you'd get your grade back and it would be C+. And I don't know if your grading system does A, B, C, D, F as well, but that's not a great grade. And if you want to go to medical school, you have to be at the top of your class. So that would feel unacceptable. We would go up to our teachers, or I would go, one of us would go up and we'd say, look, I don't see why I wrote 20 pages on this topic. I don't see why you gave me a C+. And she said, okay, you wrote 20 pages. If you can say what you said in this 20-page paper in 10 pages, I'll consider raising your grade. So you would go back, you'd cut, you'd see all these long sentences and paragraphs, cut, hand in the 10-page paper, B+. Come back. You say, oh, how can I get an A in this? How can I get an A on this paper? And you say, okay, you got a B+ by writing 10 pages. If you can say the same thing in 5 pages, I'll consider raising your grade to an A-. So she really drilled it home. And in the exercise really makes it clear that to make a well-written paper is that it's impossible to misunderstand. You don't lose your reader along the way. It has and to do that, it's often much shorter than you think it should be. And again, I know the pervasive style of scientific writing feels like you have to use big words, long sentences, long paragraphs that say a lot. This is not actually good writing. It's not good scientific writing, and it's less impactful than short sentences can have. It's hard to let go of that. I know you'll feel it, but my recommendation, the tip is, if there is a short word for something that's clear, use it instead of the long word. I collect up lots of examples of these things, but one I came across that was weird was it said the murine models were domiciled in the laboratory. What did they actually mean to say? What they meant to say is the mice were housed on site. And those are short words, but it's impossible to misunderstand that sentence. But the murine models were domiciled in the laboratory. It's unnecessarily long and complicated. So short words were possible. Short sentences were possible. Short sentences have a lot of punch. They have a lot of impact. To get a sentence short, it usually means one idea per sentence. If you look at long sentences, there's actually 3 or 4 different ideas that are in that one really long sentence. By long sentence, I mean any sentence with more than 40 words probably should be at least 2 sentences. And look for what are the different ideas. Break apart the ideas, 1 sentence per idea. And how long should a sentence generally be? 22 words. A style of writing is you can go long sentence, short sentence. What you're working up to is that short sentence has the punch. So it's very crisp, very clear, easy to understand. Short paragraphs. Each paragraph should just be one topic, not multiple topics. If you find you have 10, 15 sentences in a paragraph, you probably have different topics. Break them up, break those up into different paragraphs. Okay, so tip number 8, write short. Rewrite shorter. Short words, short sentences, short paragraphs. 1 idea per sentence, 1 topic per paragraph. And I guess I'm extending the idea, 1 clear message per publication. Okay. Then here's the template for writing a paragraph. And it may sound boring to write it this way, but it's not boring to a very tired resident reading your paper late at night, who is told to brush up on a certain topic before morning rounds. If you write in this style, they will not be lost. So think of 4 or 5 sentences for each paragraph. The first sentence is what we call the topic sentence. And the sentence says what every other sentence in the paragraph is backing up. So if you were to read a paper and you just read the first sentence of every paragraph, you would understand the entire paper. The supporting sentences are the next 3 or 4 sentences. They simply back up what the topic sentence already said. And a technique to keep it very fast, very crisp, very clear is to begin those sentences with first, second, third. You can say, for instance, transgender women expressed 3 areas of highest concern. First, discrimination in healthcare. Second, HIV risk. Third, acceptance from their family. So in other words, the reader of that is got it. There's first, second, third. If they fall asleep in the middle of the paragraph, have you ever done that? You read a paragraph, it's so complicated, the sentences are so long, you fall asleep, and then you wake up and you read it again, and you fall asleep again, and you're thinking, how many times am I going to have to read this paragraph before I remember it? If you structure it this way, the simple 4 or 5 sentence paragraph, the reader will never be lost. Here's the topic sentence. Everything else supports this, first, second, third. And then you might have a transition sentence to go to the next paragraph. Okay, so what I'm thinking, you can gather what I'm thinking here. I know as a resident, junior faculty, extremely busy clinicians, told to master a certain topic, they're reading papers, they're reading your paper. Think of that tired reader, that it writes so they won't fall asleep and lose their place and have to read it several times. Okay. Write the paper in as few words as possible. There's other reasons why it's good to write in few words. One, fewer words is a better tool for communication. So if you have one clear message, say it in few words, it's not lost. The other reason to avoid too much is if you make too many points, you present many targets for your peer reviewers to disagree with. So in other words, if it's unfortunate, if you make your main point and they agree with you, fine, you've convinced me your main conclusion is correct. And then you suddenly go on and make some additional points, they'll latch onto those and say, I disagree with this paper because they're saying these other points. So don't give the reviewers all these extra targets, especially if you can't back them up as thoroughly as your main point. Another reason to keep your paper short is it's easier for an editor to accept one more short paper than it is for a very long paper. So in other words, even though a lot of journals are online and there's limitless numbers of words that they could do, they still do print issues, and they often select the ones they want to print. And there still is the habit of, we'll have 7 major research topics, we'll have 4 brief articles, 4 letters, 1 case report, something like that. And they'll think that way. So it's easier for them to squeeze in one more short paper than it is to put a big long paper in. So that 8,000 word manuscript is actually more likely to be rejected simply because it's too long. If there's a 1,200 word publication, they're like, yes, we can fit that one in. Let's take it as a brief. Okay. Again, the idea of 1 message per publication, make it clear. That should keep it short. Now I say 1 message per publication, but if we do have time to continue, I'll talk about salami publications, which is an ethical concern of carving too many publications out of 1 study. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So there is a bit of a balance. One paper, 1 message, but don't carve them too thin. Keep some of it together. Okay, we're coming down to the last few tips. Tip number 9, this is trying to be motivational here. Keep you moving forward by motivating about why you're writing a paper. Now, I think in the introduction, when the hosts were explaining the purpose of this, they did note that a lot of you have to publish. So you are motivated simply by graduating from your program, by advancing in your department. So yes, but take a step back and not think about your own self-interest for a moment. Why do you need to publish when you do a study? for me, I think the main reason is the ethical duty to the participants. So in other words, you have asked people to share very private information. Sometimes it's about their health. In HIV research, it's often about embarrassing or illegal behaviors. And how is it that you got them to agree to be in your study? Is it because you paid them a lot of money? Well, that's not supposed to be true. Did you withhold care? If they didn't, that's also not supposed to be true. What you were communicating on some level is the information that they provide you can help future generations, help other people, future generations. More research would contribute knowledge to improving clinical practice or public health. The only way you can make good on that promise is if you publish these data for the rest of the world to see. If it changes your own practice, fine, that does benefit some, but that's not what research really is. Research is generalizable knowledge that changes practice for other people in the world in the future. So you have an ethical duty to the people that shared this private information with you to publish. You have a moral duty to your country as well. They're not only saying you need to publish because that's our criterion for graduation. They're trying to move the needle of improving the health of Bhutan. They want to instill the pattern of identifying Bhutanese health problems, training healthcare workers to address those problems, to conduct research on how to do that better and improve the health of Bhutan. So there's a moral duty to pay back your training through doing research and publishing. Of course, you're probably thinking, yes, well, we publish because we want to have an impact on health, advocacy for certain treatments, policy programs, and disparities. Contribute to the general knowledge of the world, inspire new research. In other words, hopefully when you read a paper, you say, oh, we could do something like that here, or I think it would be different. We'd have a different outcome if we did this here, or that's a great idea. That's the idea behind publishing. It's a synergistic effect on other researchers as well. Publication is also needed to either corroborate findings, verify that they're actually true and reproducible, or refute findings that are put in the publications, but they're actually not true, or to modify our understanding in past research. The other benefit that happens from writing is it's the moment that you truly understand your topic. I don't know, I've had so many graduate students and residents and postdocs that it was only after the paper was finished that they said, I never really understood why we asked this question or why we did this test or why we had this experiment until I had to write this up. I kind of thought I knew, but it was only when I wrote it up that I actually understand the topic. So basically, these are the things where you have a moral duty to publish if you engage in research. I guess appealing to our better angels that these are motivations. But of course, there is the self-interested things, the ego, the boasting, the narcissism that comes into play. I mean, let's face it, publications are kind of the treasure and bragging rights of researchers. So there's a lot of concrete advantages to publishing and publishing more, and not only publishing more, but having other researchers cite your publications. This contributes to your prestige, your renown as a researcher. So there are things that publishing does, such as, first of all, it documents the ideas are yours. Now, if you read a paper and you said, oh yeah, we did a study 10 years ago, we already knew that, we found that, but we never published. Too bad. That person who published first on that owns that idea. If you didn't publish it, you've lost it. Requirement to graduate, as we said. It documents your productivity. Often grants and funding to do studies build in a deliverable that you have to publish in the peer-reviewed literature. So they want you to document your productivity. And similarly, funding institutions will give grants to those who have published more compared to people who have published less or not at all. It builds your reputation as an expert. It's interesting, the second almost the second you become a lead author on a publication, you will get asked by journals to review papers. Say you get an email that says, we recognize your contributions to the field. We have a manuscript that we think falls under your expertise. Are you willing to give us a peer review? That happens almost the day that you get your publication published, that has your email contact address as the corresponding author. Future grant applications, as I said, and in some metaphor or some form, if you're at all involved in academia or research, it's that expression of publish or perish. That advancement to full professorship usually requires not only publications, but an accelerated rate of the number of publications each year that is expected. Okay, final tip, tip number 10, don't get discouraged. This publication and research can be extremely discouraging. I mean, one reason in itself is the peer review process. Human nature you don't like to be criticized, especially by your peers. And the process of publication is putting yourself out there for a lot of criticism coming your way. That's hard to deal with. It's also putting yourself out there for a lot of rejection. Manuscripts, depending on how prestigious the journal you're going to submit it to, manuscripts they'll usually take a lot of rejection. Sometimes the rejection is fast, sometimes it takes longer. I don't know what's worse. If it's going to be rejected, I think I'd rather have a fast rejection than several months later to be rejected. So to kind of let you know that this is part and parcel with the process of publication, we all experience it. Even after 437 publications, I still can't help but have my feelings hurt each time I get my peer reviews back and all the criticisms that come with it. So rest assured, I'm trying to reassure you that it's part of the territory. We all experience it. We all have to get used to it. So I collect up records to sort of make it a bit amusing. When your paper can't get rejected, you submit it to another journal, it gets rejected from that journal, you try another journal. How many times do you do that before you give up completely? Well, I would say never give up. In fact, let me know how many rejections. Maybe you can beat my record, but you will get a lot of rejections. So if I've published 437, that's actually more than 1,000 rejections. I don't usually expect the first journal I submit to accept it. So the second, often, maybe sometimes the third, means that I've had 1,000 journal rejections already. And then with that, you actually get the criticism of 2 or 3, sometimes more peer reviews. So that's well over 2,000 people telling me how bad a researcher I am, or that's what it feels like. Try to take an attitude of letting this roll off of you, not to let it roughly drink. Continue to try. Yes, so what's my record now for the most rejections before getting a paper finally published? 7 rejections accepted on the 8th. So my students tell me, I don't want to be that one that's going to beat that record. So let's pick a journal that's more likely to accept than reject it. But if you have a paper, if it's new, if it is a new study, never been published before, don't give up on it. Keep trying, keep submitting. Even if it takes 8 rejections, you can have the record. Tell me about it. This is another one that I think gets a lot of people. They'll tell me, oh, yeah, I did a study a few years ago and I wrote it up, I submitted it, and the journal rejected it, so I gave up. And now I say, well, you shouldn't give up, try again. They're like, but now that was 4 years ago, it's too late. I'm like, no, actually 4 or 5 years can be pretty typical for a study to finish before a publication comes out. Fast is if it happens within 2 years of finishing the study. That's actually quite good. But typical is somewhere between 2 and 5 years they might appear. So don't give up because you think it's too old. Now it's challenging if it's old and you have to find a reason why it could be published, but 5 years is fine. 6 years is fine. So what's my record for the longest time between when the study was completed and the paper finally got accepted for publication? That record's 11 years. That's pushing the limits. And when that happens, you have to take the mea culpa. You have to take the limitations paragraph and say, we recognize the long time period between when the study was conducted in the present moment. Nonetheless, and you have to have a reason, nonetheless, these data are still relevant for X, Y, and Z reasons. So depending on the context, you have to come up with it. One context that we've worked out in the past is that it's, you can say a retrospective period sets a baseline to see if it improves in the future. You can say these data predate accelerated programs. This will form a groundwork or the foundation to see if we can improve upon it. Something like that, for example. The other thing to bear in mind, in relation to this idea of data getting old is publishing is not a sequence of publishing one paper after another. Because if you did that, you would never get 437 publications. What publishing is progressively building a pipeline of papers. So yes, you have to start somewhere. So you might be starting with one paper in front of you that needs to be done. But think of what your next paper is and submit, finish that first one, submit it, and then keep the habit going. Start your second one, because it'll take a few months before you get the peer reviews back. And then it'll take another month or two to respond to them. And then the response needs an answer. So now you've already gone through more than a year, perhaps. If you waited for that to finish before starting another, you would not have very many publications. And it would be frustrating too. So start the next paper and get that one going. And then eventually what you'll find is in the course of a few years, you won't be as anxious because you say, oh yeah, this one I'm finishing, this one's in revision, this one's under review, this one I'm just waiting for them to get the final acceptance. And then the pipeline at a few years down the road, the pipeline starts generating more and more papers. Okay, I think I have one more record. Fast rejections. So if the journal's going to reject me, I would rather it be fast than slow. And a fast rejection usually means that the editor decided they didn't want it. They didn't want your paper. And that could be because the message wasn't clear, or it could be it's not really the scope or main interest of the journal. So a fast rejection usually means those things. If you get a fast rejection, there's usually no appeal. There's no resubmission, no questioning whether they could take another look. It doesn't happen that way. So that's what a fast rejection. So what's the fastest I've ever gotten a paper rejected? And the answer was, my paper was rejected before I even submitted it. How did that come about? Well, we talked before, I guess when people are coming online, we talked about how Bhutan, for me, you're in the future. It's already Sunday. For me, it's still Saturday night. So what happened was I was waiting in the Beijing airport and I quickly finished a paper while waiting, submitted it to STI journal. And when you fly from Beijing to San Francisco, you cross the international date line. So your plane actually arrives before its departure. And when I arrived in San Francisco, I opened up my iPhone, saw a message from the journal rejecting my paper. And I looked at the time and the date, and I was so excited because the rejection actually was the date before the submission. So I got a perverse excitement that's going to be a world's record that'll be very hard to beat. Okay, so wrapping up this section, I think we're kind of on time. Do you always have to do the Willie's way? Do you have to do it this way? What if you had a different way? Let me say, of course not. What I'm trying to give you is that 4x4 template, the order of writing, what each section is really meant to be as a fallback, that if you get stuck, take out this slide, look it over and see if in that 4x4, you could look at some of those 16 pieces and say, okay, I know what this piece is. Here's where I got lost. Let me get back on track. If you find a different ways of doing things works better for you, of course you should go with them. And I think I have a few other reasons why you might do something a little bit differently. One is if your boss, your mentor, your professor tells you to do something different. It may happen that they say, I want you to do the introduction first because I think you need a better mastery of the topic before you start writing. That's perfectly legitimate. You can't say, but Professor Willie said not to do that. Do that if that's what your boss or mentor says. If you read the instructions to the authors for the journal you want to submit to, and they're telling you to do something different than I told you, do what they say. In fact, tip number 3, I think, is follow directions. So follow their directions. It won't help to say, well, Willie does it this way. Others, and I'm not too sure of this, people will say, well, I'm in psychiatry and the norms of my field are different than what you're saying. You're more public health, clinical research, physicians, nurse, public health practitioners, epidemiologists. My journals are different. That may be true, but on the other hand, some of these things that I'm saying apply across fields, such as the clarity of writing, for example. The type of publication also will change things a bit. What I'm telling you is more a quantitative paper, quantitative data on a new study. Qualitative studies are a little bit different to write up. Review papers that are summarizing other publications are different than new data. And there are other types as well. And again, the overriding rule should be whatever works best for you. After you gain experience, I'm sure you'll have your own tips and tricks to share and lessons learned of how you would rather do it. Okay, so I think it's 11:05 or something like that, your time. I think we were going to take a little break and then come back maybe at quarter after the hour, have some. Do you guys have tea? I think you always had tea, which was nice. Maybe I'll make my own tea as well. Come back and we'll see what topic you want to take on next with the remaining time. I think 9 and 10, I think our host said that those might be the most useful. We could do a deeper dive into any of the sections of the paper if you want. Or actually, let me ask my host, there might be some questions that were coming up in the chat. Should we do those now or when we come back?
Professor Willie, I think we'll break for 15 minutes and then we'll take in the questions and then maybe choose to go more. I think choosing a journal, we had a talk yesterday, but so I would prefer to go with peer review and ethics.
Okay. Sounds
so
good.
We'll break for 15 minutes and take in the questions and suggestions that they have, and then we'll continue.
Okay,
that's
great.
Okay.
So 11:15 for you, 10:15 for me.
Yeah, okay. 15 minutes from now, we'll come back. Thank you.
Great.
Khusus Ankola, is everyone back? La? Hello, can we start now?
I'm here.
I hope everyone's back. So we'll start because we have now less than an hour to go. So as we suggested, I think we will take in some questions. I'll go to Q&A first because some have written in the chat box, and I think I saw a hand raised also. So we'll first go with the Q&A. The first question is from Ma'am Pasang. She says, if journals want only good papers, where do these leave the beginner researcher? So,
Yeah, there's always a home for any paper. I know a lot of it might be very hard to get into one of the prestigious journals, journals that take on all topics of health and science are harder. What you have to do is find the right match. I think, Gunsang, you said they already had a lecture on choosing a journal, but
yeah,
if
yes.
yeah, so probably some of the ideas were touched upon there, but my advice would be things like journals that are specific to your disease or topic area will more likely publish something than journals that cover all health issues. Like, for example, New England Journal of Medicine covers everything, but tuberculosis journal is specific to the disease. So the more specific to your disease or topic would have a better chance of acceptance. Regional journals would have a better chance of acceptance than international journals. I mean, I would like to think that your paper is very likely to have a home in the Bhutan Health Journal, because they're whatever you're doing is relevant to health in Bhutan. I think it's not guaranteed, and you have to make it a strong paper with revision perhaps. But that's a home for it. That's a publication, and that of course counts as a full publication on your CV. It's accessible online to the world. I'm assuming it counts for graduation, promotion, etc. I guess the last piece of advice I would have is there is an element of luck and chance involved in this. It's unfortunate. There's also biases against developing countries. There's biases against female names, different institutions. So it can be challenging, but yeah, just try again. It's often it's just a luck of the draw. Sometimes you get a reviewer that understands it and appreciates the importance of what you've done versus a reviewer that just doesn't get it. I guess we'll talk about a bit of that, but keep trying is one thing, and I would say try the journals that are specific to the disease or the topic rather than broad journals. Try regional and national journal, your national journal, for example, but keep trying.
Thank you, Professor, for this very crisp answer. Yesterday we had a session on actually how to avoid publishing in the predatory fake journals. So you added on this, just looking for specific journals in their own fields. So I think this is an additional thing, but what I think Ma'am Pasang is saying is like all those big impact journals, it's quite difficult to get in, but word of caution is to avoid those fake cloned predatory journals also.
Yeah.
Just to get published, I think we should not go for those journals. I think that is what we will add on.
Definitely. I almost have to say, unfortunately, never publish in a journal that asks you to publish in their journal. It's too good to be true. It doesn't work that way. The other thing is there are online journals where you have to pay a fee to get to, that's their business model. But coming from a middle income country, they often waive those fees. So you can ask.
Yes. Thank you, Professor. Next question is, where do the limitation go? Is it not good practice to mention limitation? I think you already answered that, but maybe just to add on, And in addition to this same question, shouldn't there be any kind of, way forward in the last paragraph of the discussion or after limitations? So
yeah, I hope I said it multiple times, but you have to put the limitations in. They have to be.
Yes.
In fact, you should take pride in being the one to find all the flaws in your own research and find a way to put that in the journal. It would be the kiss of death to not say a limitation and someone else finds it or thinks of it. That usually is a reason why your paper will be rejected. And it shows intellectual honesty and intellectual integrity to be the one to say, here are the most serious limitations of our study. I'll give you my favorite example of a paper that I was asked to review. And it was a survey that was conducted. And in the limitation, they said, we recognize limitations of our study. The most important limitation is we lost 100 questionnaires for unknown reasons. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, that's brutally honest, isn't it? That they would put right front and center that they lost, it was a study of like, they had 300 or 400 participants. So, but I guess they were shooting for 500, but they lost them. I don't know what happened. They left the box in the car or something. But I said, but I was thinking to myself, this is so honest and shows such integrity for them to say that. I mean, did they have to say it? They felt they did. Then it makes me trust almost everything else, or trust everything else that they did say in the paper and their explanations for the other limitations. So that's an example of, and I even wrote to the editor as a peer reviewer. I said, you must, if anything, take this paper because it's an example of people being very intellectually honest with the realities of conducting research. This kind of thing can happen all the time and we don't know it. That's a contribution. But you get the idea that if you are the one to say that, people will, experienced researchers and editors and journal readers know that no research is perfect and there's always potential biases. To claim otherwise is actually discrediting. Okay. And put it in the second to last paragraph of the discussion. Don't put it in the first, don't put it in the last, put it towards the end, next to last.
Thank you, Professor. I think the next question was already discussed on the number of references that we are supposed to have. I think we'll not answer that because it was already talked in the session.
Well, it can be a quick answer. Actually, I mean, what I said is 20 references, not as the minimum, but as an average is good. Some briefs will say 10 references maximum, but those, again, that's a maximum. I think the answer to the minimum is you have to cite everything that's comes from another source, an idea that's not your own, data that's coming from another publication. That requires, so there's no minimum in the sense that you have to cite everything that's not your own work. Having said that, I think you might even get away with, if only 5 are needed, then you could be comfortable with 5. 10 is fine, so if you're thinking minimums, that might be a couple benchmarks.
Thank you, sir. Next question is from Dr. Tulsi. He says, in methods section, if professor could explain further on the measurements and statistical analysis.
Well, they'll get the full presentation, right?
Yes.
So
with your permission, yes, I can share it to them.
Yeah, if I sent it to you, so if you can actually send it to them.
Okay.
My longer answer would be if there's a whole deeper dive section on the methods, and it talks about what to say for measurements and statistical analyses. So I'm hoping that if you have that as a resource, check that out. As you know, there's 250 slides. It's probably somewhere deep in there, around 100 or more. But I guess a short answer, the measurements you should focus on the things that are the cool measures or the new things, like if you used a questionnaire that was developed in another country for another study, that's where you would have to say we adapted it from this one used in Thailand, adapted it to the local language. That's the kind of measurements. The other measurement, of course, are lab measurements. And there's a standard of what manufacturer and kit did you use to test for certain diseases and the algorithm that you used. The statistical analysis one, as I kind of was dismissive saying it's a very boring thing to read, but I almost could write it in my sleep what it's going to say. I think I give you a few examples, but it would walk through things like, descriptive statistics included means with standard deviations and proportions with 95% confidence intervals. Bivariate analyses use the chi-square test or Fisher's exact. For multivariate analysis, we use logistic regression, including all variables significant at the bivariate level in a multivariate model and retain those with significance. I can recite these things because it's almost like a foreign language in a vocabulary that you say. So read what I have in the slide. If you understand what I was just sort of going through just now, that's the order of what the statistical analysis paragraph would sound like. If you can get help from someone on your team who's the statistician, they usually can write that. Yeah, it's very standard. It's very arcane, very technical, not very much fun.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor. The next question is Manikala, right? Most tell problem statement and some introduction or background. What is the main difference?
Is it the difference between a heading that might say problem statement versus introduction versus background? Just that the heading is called something different, or the expectation of the journal is they want a clear problem statement? Is that the idea?
Yes.
So what I was referring to as posing the question that you answer. In other words, the discussion section begins by providing a very clear answer to a question. To my mind, the problem statement is analogous to the question being asked in the introduction. What I think some journals are getting at is they might have a heading, a bold heading that actually says, put your problem statement here. What I think they are is phrase it as an unanswered question, phrase it as a hypothesis that you're testing, phrase it as the clinical or public health challenge that the research is trying to get at. If there's no separate section for it, what I feel it is the culmination of your introduction. In other words, you say, big picture, here's the burden of this disease. The specific area is this type of treatment we're interested in. Here's what is current practice. What isn't known is, does this work for pediatric patients or something like that? Then you'd say problem statement. Does this treatment regimen, in a retrospective study, can we find evidence that this treatment regimen works in a pediatric population? So in other words, you're phrasing the question as a problem statement. You're phrasing the question as a hypothesis. And that may appear at that point in the introduction. Other places, it may be a separate heading, or it may be a line in the abstract. If the abstract has if they have a background, method, problem statement, methods, results, discussion, and intervention, something like that. I guess I'm sorry if I'm talking too much. I hope that partially answers the question. The other way of answering that question would be carefully read the instructions to the authors of the journal you're submitting to. If they require a problem statement, they will explain it in the instructions to the author. They will probably explain it in the instructions to the authors. Similarly, that the journal also tells you what headings they want. If they say, we want it to be called background, instead of introduction, we want it to be called methodology instead of methods, they'll tell you. So one answer is read very carefully what the instructions to the author. Once you've chosen the journal, read the instructions very carefully.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor. Next one is also about the statement and the objectives while preparing articles. So he's saying at what stage to prepare. So,
meaning in my order of doing things.
yes, I think so.
Yeah. Well, backing up a little bit, if you had a protocol or an IRB submission, you probably had something that comes close to already crafting your problem statement or your objectives. So hopefully you already have some language around what that objective, problem statement, hypothesis was. But in my order of things, I would say it's the final section of the 4 pieces of the introduction. That goes big picture, specific issue, gap in the knowledge, therefore we conducted, or therefore our question is, the question we answered is, the problem statement is. Last paragraph of the introduction is where I would tend to put it. Again, look at the instructions. Look at the instructions and also look at a recent example from that journal, and you'll get a sense of where it goes to.
Okay, thank you so much. Mr. Prem Kumar Neopani writes, is it necessary to get an ethical clearance in doing retrospective study? For retrospective studies, how old can the data be used? I think that was answered, but maybe you can just answer again.
Sure. The first answer is, that really is up to your local IRB as to what kinds of studies need ethical clearance. But being a little bit familiar with your IRB, I think the answer is yes.
Yes.
When you, oh good, I didn't say the wrong thing. I mean, when you're gathering personal information about people is sensitive. That is human subjects research. And in a small country like Bhutan, the risk of breaching confidentiality and exposure is actually even more acute. So I think the answer is yes. But I think some confusing things are confusing ethical clearance with requiring written informed consent or verbal informed consent. There's different levels of at what level different procedures are needed. You may be able to make a legitimate case that your study can be done. You could get a waiver of written informed consent or a waiver of informed consent. That is possible. It's up to the IRB to make sure the risks and benefit ratio is favorable to doing that. It also means, it also gets confused as whether this is anonymous data versus identifiable data. Again, you do have to submit it to your IRB to decide that, and you should outline your procedures for how you're going to protect private information. So I think a clear yes, but a more nuanced, what elements of procedures are you going to be asking for? Waiver of informed consent or not, identifying information being protected, things like that.
Okay. The next part of the question is, how old can the data be for retrospective studies? I mean, acceptable.
Well, I mean, the retrospective by nature is historical. I think you might be able to make a case. I mean, if you were trying to see retrospective data on, mortality rates from different cancers in Bhutan, why not go back as far as you can? If the idea would be to say, I want to see how this is improved with each decade or something like that, you could make a case that it could go very far back. The other way of interpreting the question, though, is the study's already done. In other words, the asker did a retrospective study a long time ago and now is feeling too much time has passed to publish it now. I think, again, you could try to make a case in the paper why it's still relevant. But I think if you saw my record being 11 years, it was up to us to try to figure out the relevance. The other possibility is, can you update the study? reactivate the IRB approval and update it. But I would say if we're talking 5, 6, 7 years, I think you're still good. If it's 9, 10, 11 years, maybe we should talk about how to make it sound more relevant. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. Next question is from Dr. Dojipenjo. He says, open access journals asking very high APCs, which we cannot afford. Your comment.
You plead, make an appeal, try to play on their sympathies that,
We come
your
from
research budgets are small, you don't have big donor funding. See if, honestly, I've seen them waive fees or cut fees way down. The other option, I don't know how legit this will feel, but if you have international partners, sometimes their institutions have paid flat fees in advance. Like for us, PLOS One, we don't actually pay each one for PLOS One. University of California has paid a blanket fee and we just submit. So, I mean, if Yale is like that, if you had a collaborator from an American or European institution, that might also mean it's already paid for if they're co-authors on it. But, if it's truly local authors, I think it would be a shame to not try to appeal for a rate cut or a waiver of the fee. It doesn't hurt to ask.
Okay, thank you. Maybe this is more at the management of the institution level, where maybe we can even talk in the institution to maybe support you with the APCs. So thank you for answering on that. Dr. Tulsi has written, in what way they are similar and different? I don't know on what he means. If Dr. Tulsi can be more specific, so if I can write the question specifically, then we will move on to the other one. Dr. Purura, is it okay to cite newspaper articles from some data figures to be used in the journal article?
Yeah. In the full slide set, I have a whole section on references that touches on that very topic. The answer is generally no, that you shouldn't cite, if there's data presented that's in an article, you really have to track down the source in the study publication. This actually has come up quite a bit in the COVID era, because data are getting out there very fast. They're not going through they don't have time to go through the peer review process, which takes months. They often get parked into pre-publication access on websites so people can cite them. But people are trying to lift the data from the reporters, saying they interviewed someone and they said something. That's very frowned upon, and those figures can often get they're taken out of context. Denominators are not clear, things like that. It can be very misleading. So avoid citing figures that come from newspapers. Now, the exception to citing newspapers are more like when you're making a statement about what is being talked about in the lay community. You can imagine a citation that would say something like, there's been much discussion in the general population about vaccines injecting data trackers into your body so the CIA can follow you. Things like that, like get out there. So in other words, you're citing that's talked about, but it's not a data point. When you compare and contrast what's being talked about in the lay press versus the scientific press, then you can, but generally avoid it and never, I would try to say close to never lift a figure of a study that's only cited in the newspaper. Track down the primary source. If you cannot find it, if you really just can't find it, make it very clear in what you're writing that it came from a newspaper. In other words, the sentence would say something like, although not available in the peer-reviewed literature, the New York Times stated that the side effects of this drug are occur 1 in a million times, and then cite the newspaper. At the extreme, do something like that, but make the context very clear that it was not from a peer-reviewed paper.
Okay, thank you so much. In continuation to that, what about citing maybe say like WHO fact sheets or the newsroom or CDC website? Can we cite
Yes.
those?
Absolutely. Again, check there in the full slide deck. I have some comments on that. Citations from reputable websites are definitely fair game, and they're done quite often. And that often surveillance data only appear in that kind of a site. So that's fair game. In the hierarchy of things, it's better to have more in peer-reviewed publications. But citing WHO, UNAIDS, CDC, your own Ministry of Health, those are all legitimate citations.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's no name, anonymous attendee writes, could you share the name of your colleague or friend who is a Lancet editor? I just wanted to know.
Yes.
Maybe he
Oh
wants
my
to
God.
write to
Now,
him.
now I was, I stopped myself from saying it when I was presenting, and now I can't. It's on the tip of my tongue. Oh no, I can't for the life of me call it up. I will email it to you, because I'm sure once I hang up, and I'll go to sleep, and then I'll wake up in the middle of the night and I'll remember.
Okay.
Sorry. Oh, Gavin.
Okay. Right.
Gavin. Oh, it was on the tip of my tongue. Sorry about
It's
that.
okay. Maybe you're a little tired now. So when you refresh in the morning, you can email me and I'll let this, I don't know who this one is. So whoever, I'll let them know. Thank you so much. I think we're done with the QA section. I'll move on with the chat. There are some questions in the chat. And before I move to the chat section, I think Dr. Purpa was raising hand that time. If you're online, you can ask your question, Dr. Purpa. Dr. Purpa from KGUMSB, if you're online. Looks like he is not there. He's actually in the East training the SUPs for COVID plus. So I think he must be in the class or somewhere now. Okay, so we'll look at some comments in the chat. I think there are some questions here. Okay, so Prem Kumar again says, in short, what all should be included in the abstract of an article or study? What is the prominent difference between an introduction and abstract? So in this one, I would like Professor to explain what is the structured and unstructured abstract writing, because when we send our papers for review to some of the reviewers come back, what is IMRAD? So if you can explain a little bit of more details on what should be there in the abstract and what types of abstracts are present there, and what is the difference between the introduction and abstract?
Okay, so there's a lot there, so you'll help me not forget some of those questions. Starting with, there's the structured and unstructured abstracts. So there's two broad kinds of abstracts. One, and you've probably seen them, one is just a simple paragraph that might be 300 to 500 words maximum, that isn't broken up with headings. So that's the unstructured. The structured one has specific headings for the abstract. So where and the journal will tell you what they want. It might say, put the heading of background and give us 1 or 2 sentence background, put the heading of methods and then have a few sentences on methods, put results, and then put conclusions. So it will tell you exactly the headings. And then what you fill in the headings, sometimes it's not even a full sentence. Like some have the heading of objective, and you'll say to measure the prevalence of HIV among transgender women in Bhutan. So that's not even a full sentence, but it's a very succinct thing that goes on the heading, and that goes background. So so whether you use one or the other is specific to the journal. So go to the instructions for authors, and they'll tell you, structure your abstract this way. And they're usually very specific with an abstract. They'll say, use these headings, and it can be no more than 250 words. And they mean it too, because when you go to submit online, some of them cut you off at exactly 250 words. In other words, you can't even put another word in. So you really have to do exactly what they say. And they'll tell you whether it should be structured or unstructured, meaning the structure just means simply the headings. It doesn't mean one's disorganized and one's nicely organized. It just means the specific headings are there and they want you to use them. So that's the structure versus the other part of it was what goes into it.
Yes, so I think you've already answered, because the specific headings that should be, because like one of our reviewers wrote back to the journal, Bhutan Health Journal, when we had sent a paper for reviewing, the reviewer written back to us, what is IMRAD? Because you are aware of our review format, so we have just written. So I just wanted to emphasize on that particularly structured abstract. So the other question is, what is the difference between introduction and abstract?
So the abstract is a summary of all parts of the whole paper. So an abstract, it's usually, I know, somewhere between, they can be very short. Some are only 150 words. Sometimes they're more like 500 words. But in that short summary, it'll include the basic, perhaps the problem statement or background, a brief description of the methods, like it'll say, we conducted a cross-sectional survey in 10 districts of Bhutan. It'll have the key results, and you don't have much room, so you have to focus on the main results. Then it would have what I would say is the message, the mission accomplished statement. You might also have a kumbaya. You might say, these findings help us guide policy on early treatment of STIs, whatever it is. And that would be it. And so if someone only read this abstract, they would have everything about your study. And I think you also know that if you do PubMed, you can often read the abstracts, but you can't get the whole paper, right? So because you have to buy it and it's difficult. So the idea is that abstract should pretty much tell you most of what is in that paper. So that when you write an abstract, bear that in mind, that sometimes that's all many people in the world will actually see. The introduction, on the other hand, sets the stage with a bit more detail. It basically wants to communicate why the disease is important. It wants to communicate why the current clinical tools are not sufficient or where there's gaps in our knowledge. And it culminates on saying, we set out to fill this gap, or we set out to improve clinical practice by doing this kind of study. And that's going to be if you followed my model, it would be about 4 paragraphs long. And each paragraph would be a couple hundred words.
Okay, thank you so much. Maybe so there are some confusions as to the difference between abstract, executive summary, and summary. So it's all the same in the end. So some write it executive summary, some write summary, some write abstract. Okay, so if we move ahead, Dr. Namkar is like, if we have submitted an article to a journal, and that journal is published in preprint with DOI, at the end, it's rejected to publish in that journal. As we want to submit to another journal, what happens to already issued DOI?
Well, in my understanding of the question, that actually is a publication. It's just not going to be in the print version, right? If it's online, has a DOI, if it's indexed and appearing in PubMed, that is a publication. So is the question that, well, sometimes they actually don't put all online publications into the printed paper version of the journal. Is that the question?
Yes. So he says maybe in a preprint it comes out, and then after the preprint is rejected. So in the preprint they would have assigned a DOI, and what happens to DOI? I think it gets nullified. Once the paper is not published at all, the DOI don't have any value, right? In the preprint.
I'm not sure I fully understand the question.
No, I think
He
that-
means to say, like, if the some journals, when we submit to them, they say like, okay, your paper is being accepted as, and
Yeah.
it's in the preprint,
Right.
maybe in press or something, and that time they
Right.
assign a DOI. But now after some time, it comes back saying that your paper is rejected. So
that-
what
that-
happens
that-
to the
that statement
DOI
there
there?
s- That
Yeah.
statement sounds odd to me. I don't.
Yeah,
I don't follow how a paper would be accepted and then it would be in a
Rejected.
preprint, it would be a DOI, and then it's rejected. Was it
Mhm.
was it rejected after being accepted? That sounds very unusual.
Yes, it does sound unusual. Okay, so maybe, yeah.
no, I think,
So we'll move ahead, and it's almost 12 o'clock here. So I think we have a last question from, again, please, if you can rename yourself, anonymous attendee, so that we can answer your question, the earlier question also. So he says, what if the results of your study doesn't match previous similar studies? How do you support your results in discussion?
This is a good one. For a beginning researcher, this is terrifying and dismaying.
Yes.
Right? That you expect, you've read the literature, you expect a finding, and you don't find it. I guess first off, I would say it takes a lot of confidence in yourself to believe your own findings, right? But
Yes.
this has happened to me a few times early in my career, and it made me very nervous. But my mentor said, well, this can be a good thing. That do you believe, convince yourself, make your case. This actually is the scientific progress. This is the scientific process. That just because previous publications say one thing doesn't mean it's true. It doesn't mean it's true at all, and it may not be true in a different context. And one reassuring thing I read was the more prestigious the journal, the more likely what they publish will later be found to be false. And the reason this is prestigious journals want to latch onto a big finding that's new. And then it gets well read, well cited, it becomes the common knowledge. And other studies that are doing the same thing, they're not as new, it's not as novel. People aren't as excited by the third study on the same thing. But it turns out that often they have to overturn what was the initial finding. So I know it takes a lot of confidence to assert this, but make your case and try for publication. And I'll tell you, I can think of several times this has happened to me, and strategically what I've done is to say, look, either in the limitations or in the mission accomplished paragraph, come forward and we grab the bull by the horns is what we say. And we say, our finding stands in contrast to other studies or the body of the literature. And this, the fact that our study is not the same as the others merits careful consideration of why this might be. So now if you're in the limitations paragraph, you could start to say, well, we examined whether our recruitment was participation was, go through all the possibilities. But stand your ground in the end. Maybe I will give you an example of this happening to me. That we did a study in the 90s even that found genital herpes type 2 did not have an increased rate of HIV acquisition. Now that even to this day, that stands in contrast to what people believe is the body of the literature. And I said, well, how could this be? Everybody knows having herpes makes you more vulnerable to getting HIV. Everybody knows this. And yet we didn't find it in a longitudinal study. And my mentor said, no, say that, say you didn't expect it, say what say how you examined it, but keep it there. You can't, it's intellectually dishonest to say otherwise. You have to keep it there. The epilogue of the story was, it was so widely believed that having herpes resulted in increased HIV vulnerability that 3 randomized trials used herpes treatment suppression to prevent HIV, and all 3 of them failed. And then suddenly, people were more interested in what our study had to say. So it's part of science. It's actually a true part of the scientific process. You should actually be excited about this. But I know it takes confidence. But try to address it head on. Find, examine the reasons why it might be, and stand your ground. Yeah. I wonder what that was. I wonder what that was.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor. I think we'll not take any extra time from you this time, because I think it's quite late there, and then you must be quite tired. But before we close, I have I have a little small request to Professor, especially for the novice researchers and authors, especially when they write the results section. We have already mentioned just the facts, but some people tend to even discuss there, which you already said we are not supposed to do that. But just to let them know how to start a sentence there, whether they can start with the number there, or if they have to really write the numbers, like maybe say 50%, if they write 50%, or if they can maybe write it in a FIFTY in words, or if there is any rule, like maybe some say like less than 10% or 10, the number 10, then we always have to write in words. So is there any kind of rule like that when they write the results? If you can explain that?
There are rules for all those details you said. American English differs a little bit from British English, and I'm thinking your English may lean towards the British more than the American. So rules over, do you have to write out numbers that begin sentence? In American English, we do. We often avoid the issue by changing things around a little bit. Like you say, nearly 1 in 10 experience this complication, but you go nearly 1 in 10, parentheses, 10.1%, or 9.9%. So we try to come up with a phrasing that would avoid writing out a number, because that's so tedious and looks so weird.
Okay.
Yeah, things like fully 55%, you put some word in front of it there. I wish, I wish I were in person, because when I come in person, I buy a little grammar book that gives these rules, down to the very details of these things. It's called Scrunk and White. It's very easy. It's a very short book, and I can get them for like $1 each. So I bring them as presents when I go. So if you invite me back, I will bring this grammar book that tells all these rules.
Yes. Sure. When COVID is over, we'll like to see you in person and train our people in person. Okay. So another one is regarding the plagiarism, but of course, a little bit only. I'm just going to ask you, like, if there's any percentage which is acceptable, and what do you mean by self-plagiarism, and if there's any kind of acceptable range for self-plagiarism, and what is the implication of plagiarism?
Yeah. Very good questions. As far as the percent of allowable, it used to be a very concrete, something like between 20 and 25%. It's kind of a moving target though, and the rules might be changing. But I think as a rule of thumb, they are kind of knowing that there will be some areas of written word get flagged as potential plagiarism. And I think it's on the order of 20-ish%. However, they're becoming a little bit more flexible in this. Editors I've talked to will say, well, if we find flags in the methods section of duplicate potential plagiarism, we don't really care, because there's only so many ways you can write method sections, especially that statistical section that I said out loud a moment ago. So I say, if it's in the method section, we don't really care that much. If it's in, but if it's in the introduction, if it's in the discussion section, they really care, because that's where you're supposed to be talking about your own findings and your own ideas.
Okay.
They were even saying, even a little bit in the introduction, they'll let it slide. So they're more flexible. So it depends on where it is. Methods being the least consequential, discussion being the most consequential. They'll look how much it is. Maybe it's on the order of 20% or so, and they'll look whether you cited it. So it's actually better to repeat a string of words somewhat like where you got it from and clearly cite where it came from than pretending it was your own work. So those are some of the rules. Try to avoid it altogether is always wise.
Yes. Okay.
Self-plagiarism comes up when you wrote something yourself. It's your words, and you published it in a different journal. And now you're either writing a second paper on the same study, or it's the same topic, and you wrote a review article. So you're using the words you used in the review article. Again, you can't do that because for a couple of slightly different reasons. One, the journal owns the paper as a copyright. When you submit a paper to a journal, you sign a form that says the journal owns the copyright. So they own those words. You can't use it for another publication for that reason. It's like stealing from something you signed the rights over to them. The second reason they don't like doing, some may be fine with a little bit of that, but it gums up the machinery that scans things for plagiarism. So they might say, oh yeah, it's not plagiarism because it's themselves, they wrote it themselves. But every time we run a paper and people self-plagiarize, it gets flagged, and then we have a problem. We have to figure it out. So they don't like it for that reason too. So one, it violates copyright. Two, it causes them a lot of trouble. So for those reasons, they don't like self-plagiarism. Does that answer the question? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So is there any acceptable?
Except if it's the same, sorry.
Allowable range, like to self-plagiarize, maybe 1% or 2% or something?
Well, it's probably more than that, but it's actually hard to get down to that low level, especially if you're talking about a topic, but you want to avoid it just so you're not given trouble in the accusation that you're plagiarizing. I was going to say just what I said before. You can use your own words again in your own paper. In other words, if you repeat something in the abstract that you already said in the body of the paper, that's fine. You can self-plagiarize if you had an abstract for a conference and now you're pulling a lot of that abstract into your full manuscript. That's a little bit more allowable too. The other allowable thing is if you're translating between languages, you're kind of allowed, like, it's not literally the same words because it's a different language, but the order of the words and the concepts and the ideas when you translate, some of that is allowable because they know the audience is different when you change to a different language. But try to avoid it.
Okay.
And
Thank
the
you so much,
consequences?
Professor.
The last part of that was,
yes.
what are the consequences? The consequences can be very severe, and they're getting more strict about it. In most universities, if it is out and out plagiarism, you can lose your faculty appointment. You can be, your name can go to funding agencies, to not be funded. Your reputation is very, very tarnished. It's very serious, and it's because, I guess it's become more serious because the electronic software to detect plagiarism is very rapid and very thorough. There used to be an era where maybe nobody ever saw it or noticed it, or at least years would go by, so they didn't bother.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor. And there's one question in Q&A, but I think we have already answered that. Ugin Wongmo says, can publish 2 or 3 year completed research. So that I think is already answered because it will depend on your data and journals policy, So we took a lot of time, Professor. So sorry, you must be really tired. Maybe we can organize another session maybe some other time because we didn't have time to actually go into publication ethics and reviews. So if Professor is willing to help us some other time, we will organize one such another session. I don't know, but it will be quite tiring for you. So maybe we'll end here today.
No, that's good. If you want to, this time frame is actually pretty good.
Yeah, so it must be already 10
No, it's
PM
11.
there?
It's 11.
11, so it's quite late. Yeah, 11, of course, here is 12. So we'll end the session here today. And maybe I'll get in touch with Professor, and if I am able to organize another maybe continuation, because it's in kind of incomplete right now, because publication ethics and reviews has to be also completed. So if I'm able to get some time with Professor, I will let all the participants know about it, and we will arrange some other time if it's okay with everyone. So I hand over the floor to Editor-in-Chief to kindly close the session with vote of thanks. And if Professor has anything to say, I also give you time. So, Professor Philip, Professor Willie, do you have anything to say before you?
Me first. No, just this was fun. I was worried I would feel tired, but I enjoy very much sharing this with you. But I will be honest, it's much more fun to come to Bhutan and see you face to face and see the papers take shape and help write them with you. Yeah.
It is so much fun. We had to cover whole 1 week's course in 3 hours. It is quite difficult for you as well as for us. But I hope everyone, many of us could learn a lot from this session. And we hope to see you in person after the COVID. Hopefully we'll see you, and then we can conduct another one and then have face-to-face session and then help shaping their paper for publication. So with this, I hand over the floor to Dr. Pope to kindly close the session with vote of thanks.
Thank you. And thank you very much, Professor Willie, on behalf of the Honorable President from the Kisargelbo University, all the faculty members, people who attended today. On their behalf, we sincerely want to thank for your time given to us and your motivation. And we look forward to your guidance for the Bhutan Health Journal and all the researchers to get their papers published in journals. I think most will be starting writing from today itself. I think it's such a good inspiration and motivation in the right track. So we want to thank you, and we want to extend a warm invitation to you whenever the COVID situation calms down. Definitely a face-to-face interaction is at a much higher inspirational level that we will be looking forward to. Until then, stay safe, everybody. Thank you very much.
Lesla, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And thank you, Professor. And please expect some papers from BHJ for reviewing. Professor Willie, thank you so much.
Will do. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye. See you later. I'll get in touch with you, Professor.
Okay. Yes, I'll look for it.
Thank you. Thank you.